Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Husey, and I'm Director of Strategic Deterrence Studies at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and I'm pleased to welcome my dear friend, Mr. Ilan Berman. He is currently Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council, and he is an expert on regional security issues in the Middle East, Central Asia, the Russian Federation, China, and he has consulted with the CIA and the Department of Defense. And welcome, Ilan. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to kick it off by giving you an opportunity to make a few opening remarks on the latest developments in Iran, your thoughts on U.S. policy on Iran, and how the missile and nuclear threats affect the security of Americans as well as our allies. Over to you, sir.
All right. Thanks. Well, thanks, Peter, and thanks to the Mitchell Institute. This is a little bit of a weird format to do it in. I usually, we usually do it in person. I thank you for giving me an excuse to get dressed up in the comfort of my own home. It's always a little strange, but I want to sort of most of this to be sort of a conversation, sort of a back and forth, because there's a tremendous amount going on the Iran front, and we'll delve into it as we talk about get into the new China-Iran deal and what the significance is. It's very significant. But let me start sort of with two observations. And because we're in what is called here in Washington the silly season, they're both political observations. That the first is that the conventional wisdom that surrounds the Trump administration's Iran policy is wrong, right? And it's very predictably overheated because Iran is emerging as a foreign policy issue on the campaign trail, such as it is this year. But there are a tremendous amount of folks, not coincidentally, that surrounding the Biden campaign that have spent a lot of time trying to disparage maximum pressure against Iran and sort of disparage the efficacy of what the Trump administration is trying to do, right? And by the way, sort of from the outset, I think it should be clear, the Trump administration's policy of maximum economic sanctions and political pressure against Iran is intended to do two things, and two things only, right? One is to curb Iran's ability to project and available resources to project hostility outward from the Islamic Republic, whether that's in the form of ballistic missile development or in the form of sponsorship of regional proxies. And the other is to destabilize Iran internally enough that Iran is incentivized to come back to the negotiating table, to hammer out a deal that's qualitatively, from the American perspective, better than the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now, this is a fairly risky path because with this maximum pressure policy, it's quite possible that we pour on too much pressure and the regime collapses. And you're beginning to see sort of, these interesting fissures in Iran that may or may not be the signs of a pre-revolutionary state. The fact that you had, sustained protests that started in December of 2017 that continued all the way until the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, and then they paused, but they didn't dissipate. And now they've resurfaced, and they've resurfaced despite the fact that the Islamic Republic is having, a Chernobyl level event with regard to the health crisis. I mean, I think that's very significant. And it points to, sort of my first point, which is that the conventional wisdom is wrong and maximum pressure is working, right? And if you rack and stack what it actually looks like for Iran, it's a pretty compelling picture. Right. So I pulled some, in preparation for this, I sort of pulled some statistics because I think it's useful for the audience to understand. So in 2018, Iran officially, probably sort of unofficially, probably more, but officially Iran generated $60 billion in annual revenue from the sale of oil abroad. This was sort of at the very, very start of maximum pressure. Today or last year, right? So the tally is current as of this spring. That figure has declined by $52 billion, right? Last year, as maximum pressure set in, all the Iranians managed to generate in terms of revenue was $8 billion, which is a huge problem because it starts eating into their hard currency reserves, which have declined by something like a third over the last 6 months. The projection is that Iran is still sustainable for now, but it's not going to be very much in the future. You're beginning to see business partners of the Islamic Republic begin to to abandon ship because they're worried about U.S. sanctions. They're worried about being targeted. The UN has calculated that last year, foreign direct investment in Iran fell by something like 36%, and it now stands at its lowest level in 2 decades. And then sort of the final statistic, which I think is very compelling, is you have the Institute for International Finance did a tally of sort of Iranian economic solvency moving forward in time. And it said that Iran, in last year, in 2019, Iran's foreign exchange reserves held more than $100 billion. As of the first half of this year, that's down to $73 billion. And by March of 2023, they're going to have just $20 billion, right? And that becomes a regime-threatening level of economic insolvency, right? And you're seeing all sorts of ripple effects from this. You're seeing the full-on collapse of the Iranian national currency, the rial, which is now trading at its lowest rate, something like 240,000 to $1 American dollar. Right, the Iranian central bank has just pumped something like $1 billion, which they don't have to spend, to throw around, into the national economies to stabilize the currency. And there's all sorts of indicators of the fact that the regime is increasingly insolvent. And what that has done is it's really begun to reconfigure regime strategy. So the traditional regime strategy was, not to put too fine a point on it, was Trump is crazy, let's wait him out, right? And this was the sort of the argument that they were getting and the advice that they were getting from people like former Secretary of State John Kerry, who famously traveled to Europe to sort of to have those consultations with the Iranian foreign minister. But the pace of the economic decline that maximum pressure has precipitated makes that strategy very difficult. And so, the Iranians are very worried, and they're increasingly pivoting to trying to figure out other ways to stay in business, right? Which is where the sort of the new China-Iran deal comes in. The China-Iran deal, and we'll talk about it in a minute, I know, but the China-Iran deal in the broader context is enormously strategically significant for 2 reasons. First of all, it does all sorts of things for China in terms of positioning China in the region in a much more robust fashion, both economically and militarily. But it also throws an economic lifeline to the Iranian regime in a way, it makes China essentially the preferential partner for infrastructure development, for the development of Iranian telecom, for all sorts of things. But it does so at the expense of Iranian sovereignty, right? So there's a lot of arguments now going on within Iran that, this deal is actually really bad because we are now going to become a vassal state of the PRC. That may not fly with some Iranians, but it seems to fly with the Iranian leadership, right? The Iranian leadership seems to have concluded that they would much rather be in charge of a diminished Islamic republic than get put out of business at all, right? And that leads me to my final point, which is that it's all politics, right? And by the way, it's all American politics, because as the United States heads towards elections, right? We're now within 90 days of the November elections. The issue of how to approach Iran is a very, very stark contrast. On the one hand, you have maximum pressure from the Trump administration, which, for all intents and purposes, is going to continue into a second Trump term, as compared to at least what the Iranians are thinking is going to be a pretty substantial political pivot if a Biden administration comes in, right? And they're taking their cues from, the Democratic Party platform on Iran, which explicitly talks about the need to return to the framework of the JCPOA. They are referring to, Joe Biden's own statements about the need to provide humanitarian assistance to Iran and relax sanctions. I would point out sort of the latest data point is there was a study that was put out this week by the Center for a New American Security, which is, a think tank here in Washington, which also happens to be a repository of a great number of advisors for the Biden campaign, coincidentally, not coincidentally. But it is that policy paper is effectively a blueprint for re-engagement with Iran. So what you have is from the signaling that the Iranians are getting from the American side is not that a Biden administration would be friendly, but that a Biden administration would be friendlier, at least in economic terms, to their regime. And this is, I think, very significant. And so this past weekend, August 1st, the Iranian supreme leader gave a televised address in which he talked about the fact that the nuclear program in Iran is going to continue, and he refuses to engage in any negotiations with President Trump. And explicitly for a political reason, right? The supreme leader said, I won't do it because it will give a political win to Trump the way engagement with North Korea did in the past. And we don't want to bolster his foreign policy credentials in any way, right? So you see, as seen from Tehran, right, the sort of the US policy towards Iran is potentially in flux, right, or it may be in a couple of months, and they're not going to rock the boat. And so what you have is Iran scrambling for near-term solutions and still holding out the hope that, you know, the pressure is going to lessen, you know, into next year. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Talk about Iran and Russia and Syria in particular, because that's, you have the Chinese influence, and the term is if America comes back and says, okay, we're back into the JCPOA, we get rid of sanctions. I would guess the Iranians would say, thank you, but we're going to keep our deal with China anyway.
Right.
And then the question is, how does that play into the Russian, because Russia became embedded in Syria and the Middle East through the creation of ISIS and the thing about the chemical weapons in Syria, that we made Russia kind of the bargain chip guy who would decide that the Syrians, oh no, they stopped using them.
Right. Well, all right. So a little bit of a sort of a broad answer to this, but it's worth pointing out that the Sino-Iranian, the new Sino-Iranian deal is enormously significant, but it's not happening in isolation, right? In fact, you're seeing a lot of Chinese grand strategy in the Middle East, and that includes engagement with countries like Israel, which is a technology and innovation incubator, in a way that's really making folks in the White House nervous, frankly, about sort of defense, the sanctity and the solidity of defense industrial cooperation. But also China straddling the Sunni Shiite divide and engaging very deeply in economic terms with the Saudis, among other countries. And there was a report this week in the Wall Street Journal about how not only is China investing in Saudi Arabia, right, for all intents and purposes, since 2017, the Chinese have signed something like $120 billion worth of energy and trade deals with the Saudis, right? Now, not all of those have been realized, but the signaling is clear, right? China has now become a key investor in Vision 2030, which is the Saudi national modernization plan. Right, so the Chinese, it would be a mistake to think that what China is doing in Iran is an isolated incident. It's not, right? China's moving out full force into the Middle East. Now, we all know money's fungible. And so an Iran that is more flush with cash, that is more stable as a result of Chinese investments, is likely to be able to continue its regional adventurism, its strategic programs. But I would argue probably a little bit selectively, in the sense that an Iranian sponsorship, continued Iranian sponsorship of the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which is a huge issue, national issue for the House of Saud. And it may be something that the Saudis complain to the Chinese about. And so, that may change. It may not, but it may change. But when it comes to Syria, you have this really interesting condominium. The Russians are there and they want to stay. They don't want to pay, by the way, right? That's the sort of the watchword. The Russians want to stay, but they don't want to pay, which is why they're trying to broaden the conversation about reconstruction so that America and the Europeans pick up the tab. They can stay ensconced militarily, but they don't really have to foot the bill for reconstruction. But they also don't want to foot the bill in human terms, which is why Russia's military presence there is localized to the Western seaboard in terms of basing. And it also is uniformly in terms of air power, right? The Iranians control the ground and the Russians control the air. And that's frankly because, let's remember, Russia is not only fighting a one-front war. Russia's fighting, it depends on how you rack and stack, right? But there seems to be a conflict going on in Ukraine, right? Has been for some time. The Russians also may be trying to undermine the re-election of the Belarusian president, right? There's all sorts of rumors about that in the last couple of weeks, right? The Russians have a full plate. And in that context, having the Iranians stay in Syria, seems to make sense. And the Chinese, they may care about the Saudis being angry, and therefore they may rein in the Iranians in the Southern Gulf. But the Chinese really don't care about Syria. And so,
do the Russians care about the Iranian activities with respect to Hamas, Hezbollah, the Yemenis, and Lebanon?
Well,
they're terror groups.
Right. So I would say selectively. And this is where sort of, we were talking earlier about how, everything's sort of interconnected. And in this particular context, the Russians really care a lot about Palestinian rejectionist groups because of Israel, because Vladimir Putin seems to think that he has a built-in political constituency in Israel. I mean, for goodness sake, he owns real estate in Tel Aviv. From his old teacher. He has an apartment. Everybody sort of knows it's common knowledge. But by the way, right, Israel's 8 million plus citizens, and 20 to 25% of them are Russian origin. Now, they're mostly Soviet emigres, and therefore they're not inclined to be friendly. But Vladimir Putin does things like piping Russian language campaign ads into Israel, right? So it's significant enough of a constituency that when the Israelis talk about being worried about, Hamas capabilities, being worried about the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Russians listen. The other stuff, not really so much, right? So Russia is inclined to be very permissive in its attitude towards Iranian proxy groups, except for a couple of occasions where it rubs up against other Kremlin priorities.
So you mentioned Iran would like to be the big shot in a smaller empire. Right. I was thinking of the Soviet Union decided to become Russia, give up its empire.
Right.
The Cold War ended in that respect, but it's still Russia. Because as President Reagan said, he never wanted to overthrow the government of Russia in Moscow, was to get rid of the empire. That gets me to the issue which we don't often talk about is the JCPOA and the Israeli fear of this is a pathway to go nuclear. Right. What General Hayden talked about, we're building them an industrial strength nuclear capability, when that's precisely what we don't want to do. What is the Iranian strategic objective that both missiles and this nuclear program contributes to, or is dealing with the Chinese going to pull that back?
So I think
Chinese not care?
Right. So I think it's a good question. I mean, and again, not to sort of not to harp on the same point, but I think a lot of it depends on what happens here. Right. I mean, just watching what's happened over the last several weeks, the Trump administration, in particular, Secretary Pompeo and his point man on Iran, Brian Hook, have made the extension of the arms embargo on Iran, which was baked into deliberations over the JCPOA, a huge priority because the arms embargo expires in October. And the fear is that in this new permissive international environment, Iran will go on a buying spree, right? By the way, let's be clear, that's speculative because Iran has less money to throw around. But it's still, it's still a concern.
Still a concern. Maximum pressure is done.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's still but it's still a concern, right? I mean, we want to keep Iran in a box. But the Trump administration is running into a buzzsaw of opposition, not from the usual places. You would expect it from China. You would expect it from Russia, but increasingly from places in Europe. And that, I would argue, that's a side effect of the fact that the Trump administration has not had a very pacific relationship with its allies across the Atlantic over the last 3 years. All sorts of tensions that relate to NATO, all sorts of tensions that relate to US basing, including the recent decision to move troops out of Germany, right? It has sort of disincentivized the political elites in Europe from cooperating with Washington, right? Because they're also gaming the election. It's not just the Iranians that are watching this. They think that JCPOA, or for lack of a better term, JCPOA plus, is coming back. And so they're hedging their bets that that's going to happen. And along with that will come this relaxation of economic pressure that will allow them to re-engage with the Iranians, including on things like arms sales. And so, the Trump administration is having a real uphill slog in terms of amplifying maximum pressure, right? Maximum pressure has done a great deal so far, but its effectiveness moving forward depends on figuring out what to do about the new China-Iran deal, figuring out what to do about the arms embargo, right? This is a moving target, so to speak.
Let me ask you a question, because David Albright and Ali Hananen and others, and finally IAEA, have said, we have these facilities in China and Iran. We believe you've done military work related to nukes. Let us see them. And the Iranians have said, forget it, which in my reading of the JCPOA is a violation.
Right.
Because if Mr. Biden wins, I think you're right. We go back to the JCPOA. The question is, do you go and then forget everything IAEA has said?
Right.
And say, all's forgiven. We think you're, because if the administration, Biden administration comes in and says, oh, we believe Trump, you are violating the agreement, but we got to go back in it.
Right.
As opposed to we have to rewrite it. That's a big difference.
That's a huge difference.
And you go back to the status quo ante, which is what got Bibi and all the others upset, that this agreement wasn't doing what you said it was going to do.
Right. No, that's a huge difference. Yeah, huge difference. And again, right, this is a little bit of a moving target in terms of the U.S. political discourse, right? Yes. So you've had advisors for Vice President Biden say, under a Biden administration, the basis for our discussion will be to bring Iran back into the JCPOA, and then we'll strengthen it, which, the Iranians hear, I think, very differently than the American public hears, which is, we get sort of a new lease on life. We get a relaxation of sanctions. And by the way, they're going to put us back into an agreement where the terms are already expiring. So we'll be in a much more advantageous negotiating position. And the
Iranians think that.
Yeah. No, clearly. And by the way, you can see that reflected in the way Iran is signaling its displeasure with the current state of affairs, right? So every time the Trump administration adds another layer of sanctions to maximum pressure, you have Iran signal that it's going to walk further out of the JCPOA. But what you haven't seen, right, which is, I think, very telling, is a full Iranian breakout from the agreement, right? Because the Iranians, I think, are canny enough to know that, a full-on violation, right, a violation that is on its face, shatters the deal irrevocably, will alienate it from Europe, right? Because right now, Europe is hanging on to that fig leaf of the JCPOA is, listen, it's in tatters, but we can maybe cobble it back together.
How bad does the JCPOA get to the point where the Europeans and America can't hang on to it?
That's exactly right. And the Europeans, right, they're listening very intently. So which is why the Iranians say, as a sign of our displeasure, we're going to do X and Y, and then immediately say, but let's be clear, those steps are reversible. Right? Because that's the lure to bring in the Europeans again into those discussions.
That brings me to the next question, which is, what is the Iranian strategic objective? We've talked about this years ago, all during this period of time, of what is their objective? What are they trying to achieve? Is it, some people think, well, they just are doing their Islamic terrorism because that's what the Islamic revolution is about in the Constitution. They're meant to export the revolution, and they export it through terror and coercion and so forth, as opposed to, is their objective the Saudi oil fields? Is their objective kicking the United States out of the Middle East? As well as, there are consequences, deadly consequences to changes in this region of the world.
Right. No, listen, I think
that's not just Israel. Israel is someone who, loves Israel and all the rest of it. We tend to focus so much on, oh, it's an Israeli-Iranian thing. No, it's an Iranian thing against the region.
Right. So the answer is a little bit of a moving target in the sense that, we've talked about this for years, sort of, we've returned to this question for years, and the answer is different depending on where we are at that moment in time, right? A year and a half ago, 2 years ago, the answer I would give you would be, Iran wants regional hegemony, right? Iran sees itself expanding. It sees itself in control of regional capitals like Sana'a, Yemen, like Beirut, Lebanon, Baghdad, Iraq. And it clearly, the idea that the Islamic Republic will not be contained within its own borders is very much carrying the day, right? I think today, the Iranians are having at least a partial reversal of fortune. A lot of that is due, not all of it, but a lot of that is due to the type of pressure that we are applying, right? Because it's whittled down their available resources. It's constrained them. By the way, there's also something to be said for, the phenomenon of imperial overreach, right? Because you're seeing anti-Iranian protests and moves in Iraq. You saw anti-Iranian anti-Hezbollah protests in Lebanon, the tragedy that happened in Beirut this week. Right, the cake is not baked. We don't know exactly all the contours, but we do know that the Beirut port is heavily used by Hezbollah, and that the political system in Lebanon derives a lot of its dysfunction from the fact that Iran is essentially a suzerain, right? Iran runs sort of national politics there. So, I think the Iranians clearly are expecting at least a little bit of blowback from that. So if you're sitting in Tehran today, the answer to that question, I think, would be different. It would be a little bit more modest than it would have been a couple of years ago, right? Right now, when you're looking at the prospect of renewed domestic protests, the impending collapse of the economy, we don't exactly know when that's going to happen, but it's clearly not trending in a good direction, right? You want to stay in business, and you've made that calculus. Look, I would much rather stay in business of a smaller piece of territory, but a strategically coherent piece of territory, than be put out of business altogether. And if that requires me to hammer out a Faustian bargain with the Chinese, then so be it. The other Iranians, right, ordinary Iranians, Iranian nationalists, folks who are not in the leadership positions, tend to disagree, and you're seeing this play out in the Iranian press right now. But the leadership very clearly has made this calculus that right now their top priority is to stay in business by any means necessary.
Okay. Which explains the Chinese agreement.
Right.
Okay. To what extent, how do you see their ballistic missile and regional missile programs? Because the Chinese did more missile tests last year than the entire world combined. Iran did more missile tests and has more production of missiles than the entire Middle East combined. And as Kaplan wrote in the Curse of Geography, remember, he said from North Korea south through South Asia, all through the Middle East, he called it one overlapping missile range after another.
Right.
As a substitute for armies, is that you can reach out and coerce or blackmail or influence. As Uzi Rubin spoke at our seminar a couple months in July, he raised this issue of what Iran is up to with its missiles, and to that extent, are they a proxy of China? Because China would like to use its missiles in the Western Pacific to keep us out of their region. That can also play a role with respect to American presence and our allied presence in the Persian Gulf and Middle East.
Well, I think the answer to that question very much mirrors the answer to the arms embargo question, right? Because Iran is now navigating a more permissive environment internationally for ballistic missile development, just like it soon, right, unless we get our act together, it soon will navigate a more permissive environment for arms sales. And by the way, not only is sort of the arc from Asia to what is called Southwest Asia, right? It's sort of overlapping missile ranges. It's also overlapping tests of the same missile technology, right? Because there's no such thing as new technology or fundamentally new technology when it comes to missiles, right? Because the North Korea's Nodong is a reverse-engineered Chinese CSS-2 missile, and Iran's Shahab-3 is a reverse-engineered Nodong. Right, so this sort of this leakage, this seepage of missile technology has very much rebounded. And one of the things that I worry about is, to the extent that China is now incentivized to loosen even further international regulations on Iranian ballistic missile testing, because it can benefit materially from missile sales, the sale of component parts or the arms sales. And also the way China can serve a very unconstructive role in essentially stymieing any sort of consensus at the international level about the need to, at the very least, curtail Iran's acquisition capabilities until we figure out what's happening with U.S. Iran policy, right? I mean, from the Chinese perspective, the day has dawned. They're making big moves in the Middle East. There's no time like the present. And my sense is that, part of that strategy is to stabilize the Iranian regime, but they're already thinking beyond that. A newly stable Iranian regime will be very grateful. And how do we parlay that to our advantage?
What's your sense of the recent explosion at Natanz and other places in Iran? Is this There are a lot of speculation in the press. Oh, it's the Israelis. They did it. It's internal saboteurs. But the question is, it seems to me there are people that are taking deadly serious the Iranian capability in this business, despite the fact that, I mean, it helps that oil's not $110 a barrel.
Right.
And my worry is that if you get rid of fracking in America and you start restricting the production of oil and gas, and the price goes up, it's a gift to Russia. It's also a gift to Iran. It is not a gift to China.
Right.
Because my view is China wants access and a secure supply. And if they have to pay a little bit more, but they certainly don't want to pay $100 a barrel if they can pay 50.
Right. So my answer to this, I haven't played all the angles, but it seems to me that there's three potential explanations, and there may be more than one sort of working simultaneously. The first is external action, right? Covert action against elements of Iran's nuclear program, but also elements of Iranian sort of industrial infrastructure. There is a precedent for that, right? The Israelis have been very, very effective in at least delaying somewhat Iran's nuclear program in the past through things like this. They're very coy about, sort of their participation. They smile and say nothing, and whether or not that's admission is a different story entirely, but, it's clear that they're incentivized, right? So that is a possibility. There is also an internal possibility, right? Because Iran is not a monolith. Iran is a country in the middle of what I would call more so than at any time in recent memory, a pre-revolutionary state. And it bears noting, right, for historical analogies, if you remember 10 years ago, when Iran, starting with Stuxnet, when Iran was buffeted by a series of cyber attacks on its nuclear program, right? Stuxnet was the most significant one, but there was others, STARS, Wiper, others. But there was one, and the name escapes me at the moment, which was stood out because it wasn't foreign developed, right? When they sort of parsed the source code, they found that it was indigenously developed, right? So the big takeaway here is 10 years ago already, there were internal elements that were dissatisfied enough with the regime that they were willing to carry out sabotage, carry out sort of very significant disruptive effects within the country. And I think that's a very real possibility now as well. And, whether or not the Iranian industrial engineer that's now sort of facing charges for sabotage in front of the Tehran court, right, who's been sort of brought in on charges of this, is a patsy or not. I think it indicates the fact that the regime is actually very concerned about that potential for internal disruption, right? And that's the second answer. The third answer is disorder, right? So I'm a student of history. It seems to me that there's a lot of parallels here between what Iran looks like today and what the Soviet Union looked like when it started falling apart, right? Before it fell apart, when you started seeing a sort of an internal collapse, right? When the economy was declining, when infrastructure started decaying, and when the ideological system started slackening in its bonds, you start to see things like this, right? Authoritarian regimes, when they're on the downslope, things begin to break. And so, that may be an element here as well, right? It may be all three of these things in some combination. But my sense is that, what we're actually witnessing in Iran is a protracted state of state failure. And, where that goes, I'm not sure, but clearly the regime isn't healthy.
Let me ask you a question that it comes from my dear friend, people like Mike Ledeen. What is the chances of the U.S. making a deal with two parts? To tell the Iranian regime, we know who you are, you know who we are, but give up your nuclear program, your terrorism, and we'll normalize relations. That's one. Second is, who within Iran can we talk to do that,
right,
other than the regime? Assuming the regime is dedicated to the Constitution and the eternal ongoing revolution, Islamic revolution, which is what they've been doing for 40 years, which I think most people don't get.
Right.
I mean, it is their reason for being.
Right. So this is fundamentally the cold peace question. Is it possible to hammer out a cold peace with the Iranian regime, right? And what would that actually look like? Is there a grand bargain to be struck? By the way, it's worth noting that the Trump administration hasn't closed the door on that, right? It's the logical terminus of maximum pressure is to have the regime come back to the negotiating table. ostensibly to hammer out that sort of grand bargain that curtails its regional behavior, curtails its nuclear development, its ballistic missile development, and in response, we will lay off the gas, but we will also not encourage regime change elements, right? I mean, that's sort of the implicit bargain. But here's a question, right? Because Iran is not a monolith, and Iran is, a society where the Iranian opposition, very different strains, right? Everybody from Marxists to monarchists, but there's a wealth of opposition in the street. It's a little bit inchoate, but it bears noting that 10, 12 years ago, analysts like Ali Alfona, who used to be Michael's colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, were talking about a military takeover of the Islamic Republic, right? And the argument back then was the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the clerical army of the regime, is so powerful that they control all the tools of power to such an extent that they now are running the show. For my money, that argument 10 years ago was a little bit premature. And you can sort of tell it was a little bit premature because the way IRGC guardsmen voted in, say, regional and municipal elections seemed to suggest that they were still subservient to the supreme leader. But I would argue that that's maybe not an indefinite condition because, I mean, think about it, right? And you sort of saw this, again, drawing parallels to the Soviet Union, you saw this happen with the KGB during the sort of in the period of the Soviet collapse. This was an ideological secret police system that made survival, after sort of the ideology collapsed, made survival its cardinal imperative. And the way they did that was they reconstituted themselves. They put, they funneled a lot of money to sympathetic oligarchs or oligarchs who had, intelligence ties. They ended up, the terminus was they put their own guy in charge who put the kibosh on any intelligence reform efforts in the Soviet Union. Exactly. Or in the Russian Federation, right, the successor state. And so I would argue that, history doesn't repeat itself, but it very often rhymes. And you could very well see this in the not too distant future in Iran, because the IRGC controls something like a third of the Iranian national economy. Yes. It is not going to go quietly. But is it possible to convince the IRGC? You don't have to be friends with America. But we just need you to be less ideological, and you can take over. That's a different conversation. Whether that's something we want to do, completely different discussion. But it seems to me that of all the elements in the regime, the one with the most staying power is not the clergy, actually, right? It's the people who have aggregated all this economic and political power to themselves, and they happen to reside in the security force that the clergy relies on.
Final question before we go to our audience and our guests. China and the Saudis have made considerable amount of business deals of one kind or another over, I think, $100 billion. Right. Not all consummated yet. I know from my point of view, China's interest is a secure supply of oil. And then there are regional and allied hegemonic interests. Right. If they see this as a rivalry with the US. And on the other hand, the Saudis also are worried about the Iranians. They also know that we are not, Congress has been hung up about helping the Saudis in the nuclear fuel cycle. They're worried about proliferation of nuclear weapons. But if I'm sitting as the Saudis, I am worried about certainly Iran, and certainly I'm worried about the region. So explain to us kind of how you see both sides and how that affects our security.
Right. Well, so I think that's a two-part answer. What the Saudis were thinking back then and what they're thinking now. Right. Back then, and we have to remember that the Chinese move into the Middle East is less than a half decade old. Right. It sort of started in 2016. It picked up steam in 2017, 2018, 2019, right to today. All of those deals, $100+ billion worth of trade deals between the Chinese and the Saudis have all materialized, or the agreements have been signed in the last 3 years. Right. This is a very new thing, but it's a very new thing that reflects a very significant Saudi worry about, first of all, Iran and Iranian capabilities. And second of all, where America fits in all this. Because let's remember, those conversations started on the tail end of the JCPOA, which provided an enormous windfall to Iran, both economically and strategically. And if you're sitting in Riyadh, you're very concerned about what that permissive environment would do to the regional balance of power. And
Which was
if
the
you,
previous administration.
yeah, no,
For
exactly.
making
And,
allies with Iran as opposed to a coalition of
exactly.
Saudis, the Israelis, the Americans, and the Egyptians vis-a-vis Iran. It was, you know, I think the former president said, well, they'll just divide the region up.
Right. No, and that's exactly right. Which is, the Saudis. So if you remember, right, we're old enough to remember when the in the tail end of the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate, the Bush administration had to spend a lot of time reassuring regional allies in the Gulf that it was actually serious about containing Iran. And the way it did that was, we don't have a strategy, but what we're going to do is we're going to throw a bunch of money in terms and give you a lot of arms. And it's going to be essential. We're going to plant a flag. That's going to be the holding pattern. Well, all of that went away when negotiations over the JCPOA started. The Saudis and everybody else very fundamentally understood that the United States, at least under the Obama administration, was pulling back from the region, was going to let them all sort it out by themselves, and frankly, was sort of tilted towards Iran in terms of its regional engagement. And that, I think, is sort of was the kernel that laid the seed for Saudi-Chinese cooperation. Now, fast forward to today, and we have a real problem because Saudi Arabia sits at the heart of everything that we're trying to do in the region. We need the Saudi imprimatur for the deal of the century between the Israelis and the Palestinians to go forward. We need sort of Saudi Arabia to be on board with maximum pressure. And there's a third component to all this, which a lot of people don't talk about, but there's something called MISA, the Middle East Security Alliance, which the Trump administration has been quietly trying to build since 2017, which involves what is effectively an Arab NATO. And it's intended to contain Iran. But Saudi Arabia is at its center, right? So for the Trump administration, what China has managed to do, not just with putting itself in the middle of the road on the way to maximum pressure, right, which it clearly has done, but also undermine the reliability of Saudi Arabia as an ally in all of these fronts, is hugely significant. And one of the biggest challenges that the Trump administration faces is not just to figure out how to have continued efficacy of maximum pressure. That's obviously a priority, but also how to uncouple Riyadh from Beijing, right? And that's a conversation I think that's still very much in progress.
Well, can you walk down that lane? Because what are China's strategic objectives?
Well, so
I understand a business deal is a business deal. I need oil.
Right.
I can deal with that. I can understand that. But if there's something goes beyond that, which is they want their currency to be the world's reserve currency. I mean, oil will be priced in what? Chinese money. That has huge consequences, but it's part and parcel of China wanting to be the dominant economic power in the world.
And also the strategic power, right? So there was a great essay that was put out this week in Tablet Magazine by my friends Mike Duran and Peter Rowe from the Hudson Institute about, they called it China's Emerging Middle East Kingdom, right? That may be a little bit of an overstretch, over explanation, but it's clearly heading in that direction. And it's also very clear that it's underpinned by the notion in Beijing that they can supplant the US as if not the key power broker in the region by doing all these things that they're doing currently, right? It's a huge problem strategically. I'll end with this because I think it's useful. As you know, I travel a lot. And one of the sort of the quarantine's big problems for me is that I haven't been able to sort of go out and travel internationally. In fact, the last international trip that I took before we all got locked down was to Saudi Arabia. I was in Riyadh for a week, sort of talking about this stuff, talking about, looking at their counterterrorism structure and talking about China. And I was actually really concerned with what I heard because I talked to, really high level people sort of all across their bureaucracy. And everyone said exactly the same thing, which is, America's problem, and then again, right, advisedly, this is before the sharpening of great power competition against the backdrop of the disease. Fine. But back then, everybody was saying, America's picking a fight with China, and it's not our fight. We're going to sit on the sidelines. We're going to try to have good relations with both. And, I was sort of in this weird position where I was trying to tell them, like, I don't think it quite works that way. I think, strategic great power competition is by its nature all encompassing, and you're going to have to make some hard choices. And I think you need to get ahead of this conversation. But at least back then, back in February, they weren't prepared to do so. And to me, the question is, are they prepared now?
We have a question from the audience about, do you think China is seeking military bases in the region, either vis-a-vis their arrangement with Iran, or less likely, I think, certainly their arrangements with Saudi Arabia. But the question, I think, was specifically with the Iranian deal, a 25-year deal with Iran, are military bases in the cards?
Right. So I think the answer is yes, right? So let's posit that the Chinese, as part of their move into the Middle East, they are naturally becoming, trying to build a military presence. And so right now they only have an expeditionary military presence. They have one base in the region, it's in Djibouti. Yes. And the Chinese officials have talked a lot about how that is insufficient for what they call the string of pearls, right? Essentially the supply chains, the maritime supply chains that bring oil from the Persian Gulf, from the Eastern Med, around the Horn to South Asia, and how they need better basing, right? This is all of the discussions. You hear all these names, Gwadar, Chabahar, whatever it is. That's all part of that discussion about China getting leases on ports and naval bases that allow it to provide greater security of supply for these maritime shipments. It's worth noting that a very big part of what this Sino-Iranian deal is supposed to be includes not just port access in the south of Iran, but also potentially military maneuvers between the Iranian and Chinese navies in the Strait of Hormuz, which is, as the audience knows, very significant because of our forward basing status in the Middle East, right? So we have enough problems now with an adventurous Iranian navy that interdicts vessels willy-nilly and flouts the international laws of engagement. But full-on large-scale military maneuvers between the People's Liberation Army Navy and the IRGC Navy in the Strait of Hormuz is probably not something that any American military planner wants to see.
The another question we had is, what's your sense of the extent to which the Chinese are walking the yellow brick road towards a nuclear capability in Saudi Arabia?
So, I think that's a question. The revelations this week from the Wall Street Journal about how China has essentially bankrolled a facility for Saudi Arabia to enrich uranium from ore to yellowcake is the start of that conversation. There's now actually a congressional inquiry that's underway, and we'll see how that plays out over the next. They're going on recess next week, so maybe nothing happens in August. But the reality is, there are folks in Congress who are now very concerned about this, and I think they're concerned for good reason, because there's a long way to go for Saudi Arabia to develop an offensive nuclear capability. But let's remember, the Saudis for a long time, right, for a decade now, have been talking about the need for an offensive nuclear capability as a strategic counterweight to Iran's emerging nuclear program. The conventional wisdom for a long time was that if Saudi Arabia acquires that capability, it would do so by buying something off the shelf from Pakistan, because there's all sorts of evidence that Saudi Arabia helped Pakistan stand up its nuclear program. But with Chinese engagement,
as did China.
Yeah, no, as did China. But now with deeper Chinese engagement in Saudi Arabia, all of a sudden we're seeing there's actually a different pathway that the Saudis could follow. It's a longer pathway, for sure. But in terms of sustainable nuclear development, maybe it's actually better for the Saudis, if they really want to attain the strategic goal, is to build a sustainable nuclear program on the backs of cooperation with China, right? So this is something that I think people in Congress are very concerned about.
Let me follow that up, because as you know, Tom Reid has written about the Chinese role in terms of deciding in 1981 to transfer nuclear weapons technology to some of its friends, including Pakistan, North Korea, and then from there, Libya and Iran. Does the threat of a Saudi nuclear weapon compel the Iranians to seek a deal where both stand down? And I don't mean have a simmering nuclear pot of water boiling, is get rid of it. Go within the NPT, an additional protocol, and that solves our problem with Iran, And do we really want Saudi Arabia to have nuclear weapons anyway?
Right.
And does China?
So it's an intriguing possibility, right? Look, you know me. We've known each other for a long time. I'm a recovering lawyer. I was taught long ago to never ask a question to which I do not know the answer, right? So that is a question to which we do not know the answer, because you could very well see both countries stand down, right? And the US play a mediating role and sort of hammer out a grand bargain. But you could also see exactly the opposite, which is what we started to see at the end of the last decade, which is that multiple countries around the region were starting to make moves towards nuclear capability because they were afraid of what was happening. And so the logical endpoint of that strategy is a multi-nuclear Middle East in which we have a huge proliferation nightmare, right? So this is what I'm concerned about, right? Because, maybe I'm a born pessimist, but my sense is that's not the only potential outcome of this.
Oh,
right?
I agree with you 100. I mean, Henry Sukulski at NPEC, as you know, has that looks like a ball of string, and it's 12 nuclear powers and strings to all of them about, okay, now, if you're in the middle of that, who do you talk to?
Right.
Because who knows what their nuclear doctrine is, or how they employ nukes, or what they see as a threat. Because I would think, from a point of view of America, let alone Israel, just America, is that we want less nuclear weapons around the world. Absolutely. As opposed to Professor Walt, who once wrote that, well, more people have nuclear weapons, more people will behave.
Right.
You have that argument.
Right.
I have an additional one. I was reading, there's a new organization created by the Koch brothers and one of the areas they're looking at is nukes, and it's interesting. They've hired a lot of people who used to be in the fairly radical arms control community.
That's right.
And it's part and parcel of the Doug Bandow, Ted Galen Carpenter, the neocons are running the world. Let's come home.
Right.
Because we're talking about as if it's an assumption that, yes, we should be involved in the Middle East. We care about what comes out. Right. Tell me from the point of view, you're sitting next to, I can't remember the name of the Koch brothers' new institute, but it's like Cato.
Quincy Institute.
Quincy Institute, okay. Yeah. Tell us why we should be where we are, and that what we're doing, what our options are in terms of policy. Because I see some real dangers if a new administration comes in and they're pushed, oh, we got to be nicer to the Iranians than the bad guys, the previous administration. And then the question is, if Trump is reelected, it doesn't solve his problem. You still got the same problem there. And the question is, what are the Iranians willing to do? Because my view is they are fundamentally embedded with their constitution, which is we are compelled to be an Islamic revolutionary society that exports our revolution. And I don't see how they come off that shelf. Right. I see how they can come off the shelf. As you pointed out, we're going to be a smaller version of that, less empire, which in and of itself is, maybe will help Yemen and maybe help Lebanon. Who knows?
Right. Well, no, so it's a good question. And actually, sort of that view, that sort of disengagement view from the Middle East, right? Relying more on arms control, relying more on arm's length diplomacy rather than, being involved in the region and shaping outcomes, is actually something that's appealing both on the left and on the right, right? And so the Trump administration has not sort of consistently, but has at times signaled that it's very much in that vein, right? When it pulls out of northern Syria, when it pulls out of Afghanistan, right? There is a sense that, these are sort of protracted conflicts with no sort of visible metric for success or desired end date. We need to cut our losses. We need to disengage. On the other side, right, the sort of the Biden campaign, an incipient Biden administration is very much in that vein because they think, they put a lot of faith, frankly, more faith than I do, in the durability of any arms control framework that is established, even if it's established with an ideological state, right? So to me, ideology matters. And, the nature of the regime that you're doing business with matters. And that's why it's fundamentally different to hammer out an arms control agreement with Iran than it is, say, with Luxembourg. Because, it's a question of whether or not you can rely on the regime to honor its international obligations and let them supersede their ideological imperatives, right? And so, my problem with Iran's quest for a nuclear capability has never been the technology itself, right? This is where I differ from Henry Sukulski and others. It's always been the finger on the trigger, right? We inherently can't trust the finger on the trigger in Iran, which is what makes which is what makes the Iranian drive for nuclear status such a strategic problem. That's not solved by our disengagement from the region, right? As some on the right want, and it's not solved by our replacement of engagement with arms control, like some on the left want, right? So to me, I'm in the middle.
Well, it's interesting. I've argued with Doug Bandow now for 35 years, is that his argument is North Korea's nuclear weapons are a threat, but if there's going to be a war in the Korean Peninsula, I don't want American soldiers there. So we got to come home. The problem is there are a number of millions of Americans who live there or visit or do business, as well as friends from all over the world. So any kind of war in that peninsula, a lot of Americans are going to die, and then a whole lot of our friends are going to die. And my view is the whole point of having our forces there is to forestall that disaster. Given 35,000 Americans died to preserve South Korea, and as someone who, their family to me, I spent 2 years going to school there. So to me, that was important. I have another question, that is, people use the death of Soleimani as kind of a trigger. My view is the people who did the triggering were the Iranians. This question is, what do you see, if anything, Iran using its proxy forces to actually attack Americans?
So Suleiman, look, I think people, if anything, underestimate the significance of the Soleimani hit, because for a couple of reasons, right? So Soleimani was a unique personality in Iranian strategy, because he was the guy that built the personal relationships that make that proxy network tick. And his replacement, General Ghani, is not a near peer replacement, and you can see that from the way that the vibrancy of the connections between Iran and its proxies has really suffered. Right, we're not seeing nearly as much discussion about how Iran has a lot of influence over, say, Iraqi Shiite militias, right, and things like that, and you can see that playing out. There's a reason for that, because Soleimani had that personal touch. He had spent a quarter of a century building those personal contacts, and he also was a hugely influential nationalist figure in Iran, even though he was a member of the IRGC, because the regime had done a good job in building him up to be a national hero as a result of his successes in the fight against the Islamic State. So those two things combined together made him a sort of a figure of national stature. There was lots of talk among sort of the analyst set here in Washington about how he might be a shoo-in for the Iranian presidency when Hassan Rouhani's term is up. Right, that's no longer an issue. So the question to me, the operative question is always, what's the So Mike Tyson's on my mind, because he's going to have a exhibition match with Roy Jones Jr. soon, and I watch this sort of stuff. But Mike Tyson famously said that everybody has a strategy until they're punched in the face. And but I think it's applicable here, because so the Iranians have been punched in the face, and the question is, what are they going to do in response? How are they going to recalibrate their regional activism? And the secondary question is, it's going to take them time to do that. What are we prepared to do in the interim to exploit that vulnerability?
Yes, very good. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you, Ilan. Again, you have covered the waterfront. And as an alert to our listeners, I want to talk to you about an event on Thursday, August 13th, when the Mitchell Institute will host Mr. Randall Walden and Mr. Mike Roberts. They're directors of the Air Force and Space Rapid Capabilities Office on our Space Power Forum. And we look forward to people coming. Again, Ilan, on behalf of General Deptula, our dean, and the Air Force Association and Mitchell Institute, thank you for an extraordinary review of a very difficult region to understand.